Hello, everybody, and welcome along to the history programme, the Limerick Historical Society, with me, as usual, Tony Brown. And tonight, I have with me, of course, as usual, Tom Donovan, my co-functionary is kind of a nice word to use for Tom. Tom, you're welcome along to the programme.
Thank you, Tony.
Anyway, and the floors are small bit frozen, Tom, but not to worry. Also, right. We have Padraig Lenihan. Padraig is a senior lecturer in UC. God, you come very fancy up there now. Years ago, it was just UCG, but now it is UCGI, isn't it? I think now it's called.
NUIG Galway, Tony.
NUIG Galway, very kind of fancy.
Yes.
Anyway, well, Padraig is a native of Athlone, and we met years ago. And also, incidentally, he probably doesn't realise this now, but I had him on the radio programme that I used to have, and that is nearly 20 years ago when I interviewed you on that, and we had a good discussion. Also, I had you twice after that giving other lectures. But anyway, tonight we're going to talk about something that I'm very interested in, as most of you out there know, the sieges in Limerick. What was this? It's called the Siege of Limerick, but in actual fact, it was more than the siege, because as there again, going back over old ground again, that people out there know that I never learned history till I was 25 or 26 when I first got interested in history, what I picked up along the way. Anyway, sorry, Padraig, you're welcome along to the programme anyway, Padraig.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Tom. And I do remember our radio interview. It was at 1 o'clock in the morning, if I remember right. It felt like it was 12 o'clock. It was late at night, wasn't it?
We used to start at 11 and go on to about 1:15.
That's right, yeah. So it was history for insomniacs. And that was, I remember it well. Limerick is fought over quite a lot in the 17th century. And you do wonder why. I mean, you have the Irish siege of King John's Castle, 1642. And that's technically, if you're interested in the details of these things, it's got undermining, they have no guns, so they have to do it the hard way. Then you have Ireton's siege of Limerick in 1651, and that goes just on, and he's sitting down there, and he's not doing any sort of Cromwellian type Drogheda storming of the breach or what he did at Clonmel. He's standing back, waiting and waiting and waiting. That's a brutal, protracted siege. Then you have 1690, and the one short, sharp, and then you have 1691, the siege that ends with a treaty. So you have a place that is attacked 4 times, and you begin to wonder, like, what is it about Limerick
why Limerick?
Why Limerick? In the same way as an Athlone man, I'd ask the same question to some extent about Athlone for the same reasons. They're both strategic, and Sligo, the Shannon line. Now you might say the Shannon line, if you like, extends from Limerick through Athlone to what was now Lanesborough, up almost as far as we'll say the Shannon Pot, and then the Garavogue and Sligo was a slight extension of that. So in the wars of the mid-17th century, the Cromwellian Wars, we'll call them, and the Williamite Wars, this area becomes the Shannon, if you like. Connacht and Clare are something in the nature of a national redoubt. They're an area, a last defensive area that has to be and can be and must be held. And if the enemy can break into that area, then the last possibility of resistance is destroyed. So therefore, it's important. And Limerick is the easiest of the three of access. If you're coming from Cork, from the southwest ports, Athlone comes next, and Sligo last of all. So it's for that reason that there's an enduring geographical importance to Limerick, that it comes up again and again. And even the main attacks are all nearly always directed at the same place, the Irish town, and the southeastern quadrant of the Irish town, where the Battle of the Breach took place. So those 4, if you like, operations happen. And of all of them, the 1691 is the one we know best. I talked to Tom, when Tom talked about, or was it yourself, Tony, the battle, the siege. We think of the siege, we think of 1690. And I think we should think of it and it is singular. It's worth remembering because it's so, the outcome is by that stage so very, very unusual. And the outcome is, sorry, go on, Tom.
Another thing just there that you mentioned there, which again I didn't learn until I was much older, the Ireton siege, right, has nothing got to do with the Williamites. You know, that they were different. You think that Ireton was around for the whole lot, or that Kingdom was around for the whole lot.
Yeah.
We forget that Ireton had nothing got to do with the Williamites, really. He was a Cromwellian, you know, and there was a breach of time there between 1640, there was 40 to 50 years. Like, that's something I can't kind of get my head around, that why, like, there were different armies, really. You had them coming from Auckland, and Auckland coming down to Limerick. An army, an English army, again, we call them an English army, but there was a big difference between Ireton and between the Williamites. Like, William, we'd have heard of Ireton, I'm sure, but I find it fascinating that they wanted Limerick all the time. You know, I know that I can see Athlone being on the Shannon, and I can see the logic in wanting Athlone. It was a big, wide Shannon. But again, like, I still can't figure out why Limerick. We never hear of Cork. We never hear of a siege of Cork. It's always Limerick, the siege of Limerick, the broken treaty, you know. So just that there were different armies between the Cromwellians and the Williamites. Isn't that right?
Well, it is definitely what happens in the 1650s, different context, different wars, but there are enduring, even if they're different armies, there are certain enduring geographical realities. And the geographic reality of the 1650 siege, 51 siege, is that they're trying to break into and secure the hold on Connacht. But why, you ask, why Limerick? Why not Cork? Why not Waterford? Why not Dublin? Okay, like, again, those places tend not to be defended to the same extent. So, for example, after the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, Dublin isn't defended at all. Waterford is surrendered or capitulates after a token defence. Cork holds out, actually, and there is siege of Cork, and it's not a well-known, and it's highly unusual to imagine something that happened in Cork that we don't get to hear about from Cork people, but it did happen. But it's not as it's overshadowed a little bit by Limerick. It happens after the siege of Limerick, and as the consequence of an amphibious operation led by John Churchill, the future Marlborough. And it's a marvelous masterpiece of amphibious operations, and it's a lose for the Irish. And it's basically, it's underheld. But the point at issue is why the Jacobites can lose Cork. They're not going to lose Limerick. Limerick, if they lose Limerick, or indeed Athlone, they know the game is up. So that's why it's more important to them. They can afford, Cork as an outlier. Arguably, they shouldn't have tried to keep Cork because it was a port too far, but they wanted to keep up links with France, and Cork and Kinsale in particular was the best port for that. So a siege of Limerick happens, and I am struck by, in 1690, how unusual the outcome. The outcome is a lose for the attackers. Now, in all of the wars, if you think of Limerick as happening as part of a bigger European war, the 9 Years' War or the War of the Grand Alliance, there is not a single other siege that ended with the besieger not taking the place sooner or later. With two exceptions. One is Limerick, and one is also in Ireland. Where am I thinking about? Derry.
What's that?
I mean, and now you could argue that Derry isn't a siege, properly speaking. I remember I was talking to some of the loyal orders, I think it was the apprentice boys, or there was a lot of them there at this, and I says, well, Derry wasn't really a siege, it was only a blockade, but they weren't one bit pleased. That went down, that little insight went down like a lead balloon. But it was a siege in the sense that it was a protracted military operation. So those two operations end in wins for the defenders. That is highly unusual. And their wins, in the case of Derry, it's a win as a result of endurance. The garrison of Derry is besieged by an army that's about the same size. They can't break off the island of the Derry. The besiegers can't really break onto the island, but they can stop them getting off the island. So it's a sit down, it's a standoff, and starvation and bad water is the big killer there for the defenders. They think it's their diet. So it's a different operation than Limerick. Less, if you like, in one way, glamorous. It's a story of endurance and survival, and it's presented as the defenders suffer from sickness, which is again more typical. Bad water. Even now, even into the 19th century, the supply of water to the city side was a problem. Whereas Limerick is more the stuff of, you've got William arriving. He's arriving after the battle. He's gone via, arguably he should have gone straight for Limerick, but instead of which he publishes this declaration of Finglas, in which he promulgates very unattractive terms for the Irish. He could have ended the war there and then if he'd made a decent peace deal. Then he is delayed. He takes his time getting, so it's well into August before he arrives at Limerick. And the problem with leaving it that late is the Irish weather. Allowing for the calendar, add 12 to every date, so that and it's the 17th century, which is colder and wetter than today. So that the Irish summer, the late Irish summer, is a cold and wet, and the autumn is worse. Right? Yeah. So he's got a limited amount of time in which he's got to take this place. His guns can't be brought overland any huge distance, so he has to bring them to the siege train is coming from, I think, Waterford, is it? And Waterford or Cork? Waterford, of course, not Cork. Yeah. And they're coming overland. Yeah. And he needs to attack he picks as his point of attack the southeastern corner of the Irish town. That is predictable. He's coming from that direction. You always attack corners. They're the vulnerable points in any defensive scheme. And why does it go wrong? It shouldn't go wrong. It goes wrong for a number of reasons. What ones would we know from popular history? When you're looking at popular history, I suppose we think of the battle in the breach and the fight, and that's part of it. But what went so wrong for William along the way? Why did it go wrong? Yeah. In order of priority, you'd have to say that Patrick Sarsfield's cavalry raid on the siege train at Ballinity has an effect. Okay. Would you agree?
I would. Yeah. And also because the route that he took, I find it very interesting. The route that Sarsfield took to attack it, the way he went up around by Keeper Hill and around, that he avoided the whole lot he did. I know you get this Galloping Hogan coming in and all these people. There must have been rapparees around the Silvermine area, which has been densely wooded, and it was a real highwayman's territory. We have read into it. And he comes right round and comes around by Cullen in County Tipperary to attack the siege train at what we know now as Ballinity or Temple Braden, at the site there. I'm familiar with the site now, outside the temple, behind what I call Temple Braden Church, where you can look down into the field. Anyway, that did help him.
Have they got it right? It is that rock, isn't it?
It is a rock, yeah. There's a good viewing point, and you can stand there. Unfortunately, there were problems with insurance in that rock, would you believe? I know we're digressing now, but there were problems with letting people into that, would you believe? Who owns it? Did the church own it? Did the council own it? And they had it blocked off at one stage. And I haven't been out there now in about, God, it must be 5 or 6 years. But anyway, that's not here or there. But at least when you stand in that rock, you get a great expanse of flat land. And you can see why Sarsfield, the Williamites, would have camped there. Plus, there's a big field, which was shown to a friend of mine, Pat Hourigan, out near Callick and Lish. It's another big field where, again, the Williamites encamped. and you can see. But sorry, Tom, have you any opinion on this before we move on?
I have a question. Padraig mentioned there that in 1642, the only one of the methods used was undermining. So when was cannon first used, Padraig, in sieges?
The thing with the cannon would have been used. I mean, the 1642 siege, they'd love to have had cannon. And the guy running the siege, a guy called General Garrett Barry, had written literally the book on cannon and gunpowder weapons and so on. So it's not that they don't know how to do it; they just don't have them.
Yeah.
So that they don't have gunpowder. They're making. There's a local physician, Doctor. He makes an apothecary rather. He makes a small amount of gunpowder, but they have to do it without guns. So that's why the undermining, digging tunnels underneath King John's Castle. And they don't even have gunpowder to blow up the mine. They actually have to burn the supports to cause that subsidence, which happens. So gunpowder is in use, but William Siege is a classic. The Williamites, or rather the Dutch particularly, perfect a style of, you'd call it blitzkrieg, a style of siege warfare that involves heavy use of firepower, prodigious use of men's lives as well. In other words, the Dutch style is, we don't sit down, we don't do an Ireton at Limerick in 1651. You don't sit down for, how long was the Ireton siege? 9 months, I think, or something?
9 months,
something ridiculous. Yeah, so he's sitting down there and blockading them. That's grand, except that his people are suffering as well. Because if you remain static, they're going to pick up disease, the country disease, fluxes and fevers. So it's a very costly business. So the Dutch reason, in their pragmatic way, do it fast. We take a hit and you use lots of gunpowder. Gunpowder was used to knock holes, breaches in defences. Okay, you make a ramp of rubble where the wall was, and you send the boys in. And you also the Dutch use a new thing, Tom. You were asking about new types of mortar. They also use mortars. Now, a mortar is something that casts a bombshell up into the sky and lobs it over defences. That had been used by, I think the first time in Ireland, by the Irish actually, at 1640, at a place called Balnakill in County Laois. It is used at Limerick, and it's used, but the main thing he needs is to make a breach, what's called a practicable breach. Now, a practicable breach is a breach that a dozen men, elbow to elbow, can go across, standing upright. That's considered to be practicable. In other words, they shouldn't have to be crawling with one hand and holding. They should be able to walk through. 12 abreast, and he needs to have that to make his operation a success. And what I find interesting is that he probably didn't. We have different accounts. We have an account of an Irish officer inside in the breach. He thinks the breach is way too wide. His perception of it is that it's very wide, that 18 men could get through. But we have the account of a Williamite soldier, a private soldier, who's one of the poor unfortunates of the Meows, who's sent into the breach, and he thinks it's very narrow. It's only three men wide. So the same breach, it isn't wide enough to accommodate. So you've got an almost traffic management problem. William, on the day, sends in too many people at one time into the breach, and they're all trying to squeeze through a bottleneck. And as they squeeze through, they still could have pulled it off. And this is the secret. This is the thing we probably don't like to think about with the siege. I think, due to a mistake, or for whatever reason, the men who were behind the breach, Boiselot had built a retrenchment, a second set of fortifications behind the breach, with artillery guns. What seems to have happened, is that when the Williamites are pushing through, with the Huguenots leading, and the Huguenot officer stands at the top of the breach and says, "Ville gagne," which means we've taken the town. And that breach was empty, in other words, the people who were supposed to be covering the breach aren't there. This is Bozzolo covers over this in his account and fudges it, as you would. I mean, would you admit to it? But what happened, he got lucky. There's a group being relieved from 2 regiments being relieved of duty at Mungret Gate. An officer runs up to these guys and says, you know, double up. And we know from the account of one of them, an Englishman, Stevens, he describes it. He describes how the breach was empty. I mean, nobody was covering it. The people who were there had ran away. And they slink back later on. But his 2 half regiments that he was with, they covered a breach and they held off the Dutch, not rather the Danes, I think, were the Green Jackets. They were in the front line. And that is the decisive moment. These guys hold the line, but it could, for everything that went wrong, at the end of the day, what does for William is not just, you know, you can build up retrospectively, it failed for this reason, this reason, and this reason, but it also failed because for dumb luck. He happened to be unlucky. The guys who should have been covering it weren't there, and that should have been it. Game over.
I know what that breach was. That's the breach near King John's, near St. John's Castle, which is now a roadway going out through what we call Pinnywell in Limerick, right? That breach.
I agree with you. That breach is exactly coinciding with the width of with that road.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
There's an existing stretch of wall. If they haven't knocked it down yet, last I saw 3 or 4 years ago, there's a public house there.
It is, yeah. Well, that's closed now as well. But you're right.
Of course it is. But and for about 100 yards down, there's a very good section of walls there.
Down onto the Dublin Road. Yeah. Yeah.
On the other side, up in the grounds of King John's or St. John's Hospital. And there's a little gate. There's a gatehouse there. Do you ever see the gatehouse?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. But that.
Well, if you're ever bringing people around there, and it's worth looking at. I remember bringing students there from UL when I was teaching there, and I was telling them about the siege, and I was showing. See that gate there? We're standing as it were outside the gate, looking in and looking at the holes in the front. I says that was caused by the cannonballs of the time. Now I don't know whether that's true or not, but it makes a good story. And they were very impressed anyway. And because there is bits of chips of the stonework gone from there. And I think there's like the bullet holes in the GPO. Like it's very a good stone. Yeah.
Getting back to that breach, in that lovely history that you wrote in 1866, your cousin Morris Lenihan. Lenihan says in it that whether he's correct or not, but he gives a reference that actual breach, that there were so many Brandenburgers killed in that, he says, that it kind of more or less depressed William, that what happened at that breach there, it was a big mistake they made trying to come through at that.
Tony, just would you get Padraig to explain the make? You mentioned Battenburgers there. People think you're talking about cake. If you would get Padraig to explain the makeup of the army, you know, where did all the soldiers come from?
Why? And the Danes. Yeah, how did they come about?
Yeah, that's wow. You don't ask. Like the William, we call it the Williamite army, not the English army, because it is William's army. It's a composite allied force. Now he has at Limerick the following: English and Scottish, naturally. We'll call them Anglo-Irish or North Irish. So there's Irish Protestant regiments as well. There are his elite troops are the Huguenots. There's 3 regiments of French Huguenot refugees. And in fact, it turns out a lot of them are, they're French speakers, and they're like the wild geese, the Irish wild geese later on. Yeah. They're guys with a chip on their shoulder. They've suffered religious persecution. They've got a grudge. So they're the guys that you send in to do the heavy lifting. So you got the Huguenots. Now you also have, and this is hard for us to understand, but the King of Denmark rented out his army. Yeah. Year by year. So therefore, you have a Danish contingent of about 5,000 to 6,000 men, and they're just rented. They're rented, and they're commanded by a German called the Duke of Württemberg. So that's Danes. Now the Dutch. You have the Dutch army, and there are various units in the Dutch army, of which one is the Brandenburgers, who are, I think, despite their name, they're not German. It's a Dutch unit, but I think the Duke of Brandenburg's, they're the Duke of Brandenburg's unit. Yeah. In the same as the Duke of Württemberg is a German associated with the Danish troops. It's all transnational, so it's quite confusing. But they're Dutch troops, or they're a Dutch unit. There may in fact be quite a lot of German. Maybe most of the personnel are Germans. In the same way as at the Battle of the Boyne. I'm getting off the point. The French units under what's his name, Lazun, most of the troops in those French units were actually German speakers, who had been, some of them taken prisoner. So there's a complicated sort of thing going on there. But so the Williamites are an allied army. And Tom's point is important because it's not a very cohesive, well-articulated army. It's very hard to make things happen and to stop things, bad things from happening, because people don't understand what's going on. Yes, all the officers, or most of the officers, can speak French. So French is the universal language of command on both sides. Okay, great. So, but once you go beneath that, and it's not a first language for anybody, William has a problem, and what Tom's question ties into yours. He has made a mistake. He sent too many men against too small a space. The Irish are holding it, and as they're being fed into this meat grinder, they're being shot down, and more have been fed in. And now it gets worse. People are standing up on the walls, including women, men, civilians, soldiers without weapons, and they're chucking down stones. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot, but if you're closely packed, like, I don't know, like a crowd coming out of Thomond Park or out of Crow Park or whatever, and you're shoulder to shoulder packed, and large lumps, large stones that have been gathered are being chucked down on you, that's lethal. And we have an account of one fellow, again, the same misfortunate soldier. He says he couldn't move. He was being brought back and forth, swayed by the crowd. He was hit by a stone, semi-concussed. And as he was making his way, he thought maybe an hour later, he was shot in the kidneys as he was going. So he had a very bad day. And his question was, what were we doing there for such a long time? And that's a very good question. What happened was, William's camp is at a place called, this is where it gets seriously strange. William's camped at a place called St. Patrick's Well. It's up Singland. Okay. Now, there is, and I'm moving off. Has anybody ever heard of the prophecies of Columkill?
Oh, I have.
Yeah. What do you know about them?
American St. Columkill. I read them once and I said to myself, these fellas are for the boards. You could take them serious now. Which specific one are you talking about now?
Well, you see, the prophecies are written, and they are written in the 17th century, and they purport to be morale boosting devices. But there's one prophecy that is current 50 years before the siege. Okay, this is well before the siege. And it's saying that the English will conquer until they come to a hill at Knocksangle, or Singland Hill outside Limerick. That's not drawn up after 1690. We see that in 1642. And fellas are scratching their heads, what are they talking about here? And that is a reference to Brian Boru's people capturing Limerick and killing the Vikings on the hill of Singland afterwards. So it's a kind of a history will repeat itself. But weirdly, history did repeat itself. William does camp on Singland Hill. Story adverts to George Story, the historian, adverts to this ridiculous, as he sees it, nonsense, this prophecy. But don't underestimate the power of prophecy. If people think that they're not only that they're predestined to win, despite appearances. This is the turning point. This is where ever the point of articulation of Irish history is here now, England, 1690. I think that's part of the explanation. So you've got these fellas, the defenders, and some women as well. I mean, despite your skepticism now, there were some Amazons involved in the wars as well. I think, like John White tells us that, he talks about the feminae, the women of Limerick, shaming those who ran away and intercepting them and all going back to the breach. So it's a desperate struggle. The Williamites aren't getting through. The sensible thing would be to call it a day. But William doesn't call it a day. There's a breakdown in communication between him and his commanders, who are a Scottish man, James Douglas, and Wurtemberg, who was in charge of the second column, and they simply beat their heads against the walls for far too long. When William finds out, William sends word that they stop doing it, but the word doesn't get through in a timely fashion, and that leads unnecessarily to very heavy casualties. And so he suffers. Now, in the Williamite War, what sort of casualties? I haven't got the figures. I think we're looking at between people killed on the spot and people who die subsequently, you're looking at 1,500 fatalities, which is heavy enough. Now, it's not disabling. William would take that had he won. He'd be happy enough with that, but he didn't win. And now he's looking at resuming the siege. Probably, why was the breach not wide enough? We're back to Ballinity. We forgot about Ballinity. It's not wide enough because he doesn't have enough gunpowder. Because the gunpowder, Sarsfield did not stop the cannonballs, the cannon shot, or the cannon guns getting through. I mean, how do you destroy a cannon gun? You can't. You can burn the carriage. You can destroy the carriage. You can try and spike it, but ultimately you can't destroy a gun. But you can burn the powder, and that's what he did. And he blew it up or burned it. And that means that they're not able to make as good a breach as they would have expected. Now the rains are beginning. The ground is getting soft. The guns could sink. And he decides to call it a day. And he leaves. It's a huge blow. Instead of the Williamite War, 1689 to 91, it could have been 1689-90.
Two points to that. First of all, just as regards the cannon, Lenihan says that out at Ballinity, Temple Braden, that Sarsfield is reputed to have put the top, capsized the cannon and put the front of the thing into the ground, of the cannon into the ground, and blew them up. And apart from that, then, who was paying and how? We don't know who was paying and how did William pay these soldiers? What did he do as regards payment for all the men that were killed? And how much was he hiring? Like, what was the payoff? We know during the Cromwellians that you had the adventurers, right? They got land for the money they put forward. But how was he paying for all these Dutch troops and Danes? What was he giving in response to the King of Denmark?
Well, you see, he brings for the first time in England, he raises a land tax. The English had never paid tax before until William came. Okay, they'd never paid regular tax. He institutes a regular property tax, not just the usual excises and stuff like the invisible taxes. This is not a stealth tax. This is a tax on property. Property owners, the gentry, are outraged by this. And it gets worse. William's wars are horrendously expensive, and he squeezes the English. They come to regret, most of them, having invited him over to depose James. They didn't know when they're well off. So William pays. He pays by squeezing. He uses England as a cash cow for his wars, because Holland had been wealthy. It was the Dutch century, but it's overextended itself. Certainly after the war with France, 1672 to 78, and it's not what it was. So it doesn't have the sort of mercantile wealth that England has. So England is his cash cow, and he pays, and he's able to pay his troops by contemporary standards well, and above all, on time. So it's a reasonably well-paid army. Now, having said that, and I've moved off the point of Limerick, the biggest catastrophe of the Williamite conquest is an event or non-event that nobody has ever, hardly anybody has heard of. We've heard of Limerick, we've heard of Aughrim, we've heard of Athlone, we've heard of the Boyne. Who's heard of Dundalk?
No, you hear nothing of Dundalk.
In the first winter of the war, the second winter of the war, 1689 to 90, Marshal Schomberg, the commander of William's army, William hasn't come over yet. Marshal Schomberg has a large army of 20,000 men plus. He's marching south from Belfast Lough on Dublin. That should be it. It should be the Jacobite War, Williamite War, 1689 to 1689. I mean, this is the blow. This is going to do the biz. And he stops halfway to wait for cavalry reinforcements, camps outside Dundalk at a racecourse outside Dundalk. And in that month, the following month, and before he breaks altogether, he never gets to Dublin. He loses more than half of his army, more than half, through sickness, through staying in one place. Basically, the guys, the horse manure, the usual thing, they contaminate their own water supply. Then they're all huddled up together. It's raining, they're feeling sorry for each other. They're lice-ridden. And they then pass typhus to one another, or the hospital sickness. And so that the biggest single loss of life in the Williamite War, bigger than every other action taken together, happens at Dundalk without a shot being fired. And that's something that's we tend to neglect in the history of warfare. More soldiers die from the very fact of being congregated together. And that's why William's style of siege work, don't be faffing about or foostering around. Get in and get out, get it done. And if that means you have to take casualties in the short term, you just do it. Sorry, I digressed and I've forgotten the question.
Just as Dundalk now, there's a man that often intrigued me now as regards Dundalk, Hamilton. He was, I can't think of what position he had, but he became Lord Clanbrassil, actually, which is still a few streets in Dundalk related to him. This Hamilton was William's man in Dundalk, and he became the first Earl of Limerick. It was a title given to him by William. But luckily for the Perry family in Limerick afterwards, the Hamilton family seems to have died out, because as we know, the Earl of Limerick today is of what's known as the second creation. It wasn't around when Perry in 1800, he couldn't get the title because this Hamilton, who was controller of the troops in Dundalk, have you ever come across this Hamilton? He was Clanbrassil anyway, and he became the first Earl of Limerick. I don't know what position he had, the Williamites.
I'll do what I always do when I don't have the answer to a question. I'll answer like a politician, I'll answer a different question.
But there's
the only Hamilton I know about, and he's an important guy, and I'm glad you asked me about him. In fact, the Hamiltons of Nina. That's to say, the Hamilton who is connected to the Butlers, to the Ormond. Now, in the Williamite War, there's a number of Hamilton brothers. There's Richard Hamilton, who was originally belonging to this North Tip Nina family, who was in charge of the siege, the Irish siege of Derry. There's his brother, he's captured at the Boyne. There's his brother, John Hamilton, who fights at Limerick and who's a senior officer there.
Could be him.
And you've got...
I'd say that could be him. Would it?
And then you've got John Hamilton, and you got an Anthony Hamilton, another brother. He wrote the Memoirs of Gremont. Now, these guys they're of planter origin, but they're Catholics. And the interesting thing about a lot of the planter families, and you get this in County Limerick as well. You have families like Stevenson Oliver Stevenson, 16 killed in Liscarroll in 1642. Yeah. Is of a planter settler. He's from a place called Lismoylan. Is that?
Yeah, it's out near Kappa. Yeah, it's out there.
Kilmoylan.
Sorry,
Kilmoylan.
Yeah. Yes, and there's others. So a lot of these names, Herberts in Springs,
Okay.
in Kerry, and so on, they, if you like, become Catholic, and they're involved, and the Hamiltons fall into that category as well. So when it comes to the Williamite or Jacobite wars, we see the Hamiltons, notwithstanding that branch. Now, there's also a quite closely related branch of that family who are, there's a guy called Frederick Hamilton in Manor Hamilton, County Leitrim, and he was active in 1642-43. I think he's a brother of that George Hamilton of Nina, and he is an ultra-zealous Protestant, hates papists, and is something of, even by the standards of the time, a raving psycho. I mean, he's a bad one. And so they're a divided family. But I think you may be thinking about the Lord Clanbrassil connection. To go back to your question, I can't answer that, but I can answer about generally about Hamilton's. Maybe I kick the ball back to you, lads.
Yeah, I think he said John Hamilton fought in Limerick, because why would he have gotten a Limerick title from William unless he had been here fighting? But he wasn't in Dundalk. No, anyway, that's irrelevant.
No, you have me puzzled. It's the same way as Ginkle. Yeah, Ginkle or Hinkle becomes, what is it, Earl of Athlone, and Massour of Igny becomes Earl of Aughrim or whatever. So they're associated. So these battle honours are associated. So why would somebody be called? They must be connected with the Williamite siege. But there's no Hamilton is in charge. There's no Hamilton on the Williamite side that I can think of that is important on the Williamite side. But having finished our interview, I'll have an aha moment and it'll come to me.
Padraig, if you're telling your students about the sieges, what sources would you recommend? Say objective sources.
Yeah.
Like, I know you have to, we say Stevenson and soldiers writing their accounts, but is there objective kind of fair?
I no, everybody has. There's no such thing as, they're all biased. I mean, the question is, fascinating thing about being a historian is, you first of all, you have to look at them all. You have to adjust for their biases, and you have to do so. I think historians and academics are too inclined to go around showing people what's under the bonnet. In other words, they're too inclined to be discussing, I looked at this source and I looked at this source and I believe this because of this and I believe this because of this. And before, you're talking about process rather than outcome. You kind of have to get through that quickly and say, I trust. Like, for example, if I was saying to a student, you look at him and look at him, he's going to say, we killed thousands of the Irish, and the Irish are going to say, we killed thousands of them. What do you do? Always believe. I believe people when they talk about their own losses. I don't believe them when they talk about the losses of the enemy. And if you do that, you'll generally get a ballpark figure as what actually happened. Usually. Now, sometimes. So that's one thing that people tell porcupines about. How do you know that somebody won a battle and somebody lost a battle? Because sometimes they lose, but they think they won. You'll ask, and that's where they'll tell porcupines, they'll tell lies about how many. They're going to say, we've captured X amount of flags, or we captured X amount of guns. There's certain things that are harder to lie about. Guns, artillery guns. If at the end of the day, you've got the enemy's artillery guns, you've won.
Yeah.
Because he's gone. He wasn't able to take his guns with him. That's a token of victory. So how do I adjust? If I was looking at this, my favorite source remains George Story's impartial narrative, which is not impartial at all. But it's lively. It's got great illustrations, and he's got a lovely eye for a good anecdote. You need a storyteller, a natural storyteller. And whereas a lot of the military accounts, he's a clergyman, but he's got a good eye for to develop. Whereas a lot of the military accounts read like unit journals. At such and such a time we did this, then we did this, and then we did this, and then it's all very dull and boring. Another source I'd recommend, and they're as rare as hen's teeth, but we have a couple of them for that, are if you can get other ranks accounts soldiers. On the Williamite side, I'm fascinated by the survival of a French language account by a private soldier in the Williamite army. And it gives you a radically different perspective, that worm's eye view of what's going on, including the siege of Limerick. Now, why is he able to write? Because he's basically, he was, as we would say in Irish, he was oversoggered. He was training to be a clergyman, and he was taken with dancing and playing billiards, and he got distracted, joined the army for adventure, ends up as a private soldier, very quickly comes to regret that decision. But you get an articulate, literate man who's able to describe the experience of life in the ranks. And he takes us through Dundalk. He barely survived Dundalk. He takes us through Limerick. He's badly wounded at Limerick, and he's very lucky. He's not left in the hospital at Limerick, because this is one of the unknown events of the Williamite War. When the Williamites are packing up, they are so anxious to be out of there that they're leaving a lot of impedimenta behind them. They don't want the Irish to get. So they create a bonfire. And in that bonfire, they actually consume their own hospital with their people inside it.
Oh.
Yeah, that's horrendous. Now, the alternative, we don't know that from Williamite sources. They do not talk about that at all. The Irish advert to it. Now, I initially thought maybe the Williamites left their sick behind them in the hospital, and the Irish set the hospital on fire.
Yeah.
But had that been so, I'm pretty sure the Williamites would have mentioned it.
Yeah.
But the Irish sources mention it as the Williamites having done it. So but anyway, our friend, this Huguenot private soldier, he was lucky enough that he was considered well enough to be transported. He's brought to Clonmel, and he recuperates there. So he misses the hospital experience. He survives, goes back to, he's a French-speaking Swiss, actually, and he goes back and he writes about his experiences. That is one of the few, in fact, it's the singular one. If I was recommending something to read, now I know I'm not promoting myself. I edited with Geraldine Sheridan, a colleague of mine in UL, translated it, and we did a joint. You get it on JSTOR. It's there.
Yeah.
A guy called Demorsier, Demorsier, and I strongly recommend that.
Yeah.
What does Demorsier cover? What does he actually cover?
He covers from the time he comes to Ireland in 1689. So he describes Dundalk, he describes the sickness, he is at the Boyne. His account of the Boyne is very interesting. He's with the Dutch Guards at this stage. He's got out of the Huguenot regiment. He's browned off. They're not getting paid regularly enough. The guardsmen get paid more. And his memory of the Boyne is this, that he didn't get to finish his breakfast. They're all waiting behind a hill near Old Bridge Fort. They've set up their campfires. He's cooking his breakfast, and then the officer comes down and says, "Pull away, lad. Come on, up. We're going across." So it gives you this idea. Anybody who's served and I served in the army myself, it's this hurry up and wait phenomenon. When the lower down you are in the line, stuff is happening, decisions are being made, and by the time you get to hear about it, it should have happened yesterday. And he gets that feeling of being buffeted by events outside your control. You get that very strongly with Demorsier. Having survived the Boyne, he then is involved in our siege of Limerick. He's actually among the crowd with the Dutch Guards outside the breach. And he describes stuff being chucked down on them. And he describes, I don't think he mentions women chucking stuff down, but then he wouldn't see them. All he sees is rocks coming down on his head. And he describes that very vividly and very feelingly in a way that you don't get from officer accounts. They're more detached.
One quote there from Story, he says that at one stage that they were so near the Irish trenches that we could hear their damn brogues. Yeah, it's one quote from Story. And,
that's right,
and just to get away from that, what is your opinion of one of these myths we hear in Limerick about all the women going up and fighting as strong as the men. Could it have happened? Now, I know when they broke into John Street, when they came around by, as we know today, Donkey Folds, and that angle there, that there would have been an attack at the Brazen Head, which was a big pub there. But what is your opinion of all these women? Would they have been fighting, or would they have been in fighting?
I don't think it's unusual. As I said, as we were chatting beforehand, do you remember I mentioned there's a poem dedicated to the governor of Limerick called Boiselot, and it's written by an Irish exile, a clerical exile, John White. He's in France, and it's a poem written in Latin, and he specifically adverts to the femina or the muliers. I think I might use both words, are involved in the action, and by their bravery they shame those soldiers who ran away from the breach, who then slink back to the breach or to the walls and do their duty. So if it's a myth, if you like, it's a myth that is created very early on by somebody who most likely was there or talked to people who were there. So it's and it's not that it's not completely unusual. We see it, for example, at the siege of Ross in New Ross in County Wexford, 1643. The women are in the breach. If you are a civilian, you're not going to be, and if the thing has come to the point that they're coming through the breach, the soldiers who are coming through are not going to respect the fact that you're a civilian. You are going to be robbed, raped, murdered, pillaged, whatever. Therefore, you have your back is to the wall. So it's not unusual for women folk and civilians, and people who will otherwise be elderly men, to get stuck in there as well. Get stuck in, but more often what they get stuck into as in the donkey work of, I talk about making retrenchments behind the walls. The civilians would have been dragooned or would have volunteered to do that kind of work as well. So they'd be more as likely to be involved in the spade work. And there's a lot of spade work.
I can imagine, yes. What's your opinion, Tom? Do you think the women were out fighting? Or were they...
Well, it depends what women you're talking about. Right? Yeah. I know, what is it, probably call them the Amazons. I mean, going into the 19th century, I mean, there was women fighting on the streets regularly, but that was more drink induced. But I remember, like in the 19th century, in faction fights, women got involved. There was famous women involved in faction fights, like, so. I can imagine it, but like if there's only one source of it, so I know the first Kevin Hannon wrote about the first I saw it, the brave women of Limerick,
what was Kevin's opinion? Can you remember?
Well, he just wrote about it. He just wrote. I don't know what his source was.
Yeah. He never gave no source.
Was he skeptical about it, or was he? I'm inclined to believe it now. I'm usually somebody who knocks these ideas, but not everything.
No, you asked me what was his opinion. He didn't give a source, you see. So I don't know. It's probably the same source as you used. If that's the only source that you're aware of.
Lenihan kind of pumps it up now as well. It's very dramatic what Lenihan says about the breach and Ochoin, that if this had been all this old talk he puts in that some of the people are supposed to have said. I don't like what Lenihan says now about this. He kind of pops it up a bit, because he was really right wing now. Lenihan was, as far as I'm concerned, but kind of props it up a bit. But you just wonder, what he thought, what people thought of the whole thing, Anyway, let's not hear that.
Totally, but it is dramatic. I mean, this stuff is. If you can imagine a picture. I'm trying to conjure up a word picture. There's a pall of smoke, big black smoke, hanging over and is blowing gradually. The story describes it. This is why story is so evocative. There's a pall of black smoke blowing out towards Cracklow, towards what's that hill with the golf ball?
Hill.
No, not keeper. No, the one, is that the one with the golf ball on it?
The lot, yeah.
Yeah, and it's blowing in that direction, and he describes the noise, the noise of guns going off at the same time. Yeah. It's pretty dramatic, dramatic stuff, and even the I don't know, the Civic Museum used to have a lovely display of artifacts.
Larry Walsh did that. Larry, yeah.
Was it? I don't. That's gone now, isn't it? Or
that's gone. That was brilliant because it explained it properly. It was great when you went in and you would. That was lovely.
Well, Larry had a great understanding of the siege. And what was fascinating for me was when they dug up the canal, Tony. The time they were doing the new floating, whatever it was there in Limerick, but they dug up all the Abbey River there, and they found loads of cannonballs and artifacts from the siege. Yeah. Which brought it back to, made us realise that there was a siege, it wasn't fiction,
Yeah.
But where did all this stuff go? I mean, I remember seeing it in the old upstairs. There was even a skeleton, or there was a guy, or bones, a guy with bow-legged who was probably a cavalryman who was dismounted. Yeah.
And his bones were Larry went to great bother now. He spent a lot of time in that exhibition, I remember.
To answer your question, it's in a warehouse on the Dock Road because of lack of space. The new Civic Museum is only a small little exhibition area. We see what they did in Waterford. They have a beautiful new museum down in Waterford. We should have something equivalent to the Hunt Museum to display our local history. The Hunt Museum isn't a local history or a history museum.
Really Limerick, I suppose, the Hunt Museum isn't really Limerick artifacts.
No. But my point is,
But you'd imagine, to think of an exhibition or artifacts like that being buried away, when something like that there couldn't be, I don't know, a display area near the breach, maybe even converting that little gatehouse in St. John's Hospital into a little exhibition area. Jesus, wouldn't that be a mighty thing to do?
Oh, of course it would. But the interest isn't there, unfortunately. The interest is not there, Listen, can I ask you, Padraig, what is that map behind you on the wall?
That is, will I bring it down and show it to
you?
Yeah.
Now you're not taking down half the wall with it. Blaming us for damaging
the wall. It'll have a breach in your wall.
You see it clearly. He said we made a hole in the wall. What?
Now, can you see the title on it?
Yeah, there's a shadow on it. I can hear, yeah. Oh yeah, Arlanda, yeah, I can see that, yeah.
Yeah.
That's French, is it?
It's French. It's a guy called Nicolas Sanson, and it's a very detailed map of the time, 1693, I think this one is, but there would have been other ones. That would be the map that the French would have been operating off.
Move it up a small bit, Padraig. Lift it up.
Of course.
Limerick.
But if I lift it up, you can't. You can see Limerick. Can you see it?
Yeah, move it up another small little bit. Move it up another 6 inches. Oh yes, now, yeah. Yeah, I can, yeah. Why was this map done and when?
It's done by, I'll hold it steady. It's done by the French, because the French are heavily involved in the Williamite War. The French dominate the seas between Ireland and France in that window, 1689, 1991, and they, up to 92, and they're sending reinforcements and troops to Galway, Limerick, Kinsale, and Cork. And they have a vested interest they have very good maps of the coasts, and the map relates to the time we're talking about. It expresses the French interest in Ireland, and even after the Williamite War, there's plans to revisit, to invade. So hence they've got very good maps, and this would be a contemporary. As I was telling you about, it's copied from an earlier, the Cromwellian survey, after Ireton's siege and the defeat of the Irish. Petty measured out the country, and most those maps have been lost, but the information in them was used to create a national map, and this is the most complete example of that. Oddly enough, that information was fed into this French copy. So even though the information in it is maybe 40 years out of date, it's still pretty relevant. And
there's an awful lot of detail in it.
An awful lot, and the spellings are a bit unfamiliar. I'll hold it up to you a bit more. You can see County Limerick and Clare.
I can.
Yeah. Lads, I won't be able to hold up much longer. I'm not as strong in my arms as I used to be. But there you go.
Maps themselves are very interesting as regards detail. You know, how did these guys know? Even you take the likes of John O'Donovan going around with a chain, you know, on horses, and they know Google, and you had these fellas. How did they were able to get the detail? Would you agree, Tom? The detail that these fellas had in some of the maps is fascinating, you know, to see. And to think that
well, you see, your man Petty's survey is, when compared to modern cartographic techniques, it's very good. It's very accurate. But he did it because he had a big team of fellas. I mean, they weren't doing. Each team was covering relatively small amount. It doesn't require great. He's got ex-soldiers. They're measuring with chains, and they're measuring with how they do. And they've got compasses, and you know, so they've got a general idea. So it's not, it's just coordinating a big project and getting lots of people doing it. And if you have enough people doing it, you get it. But I'd imagine the maps are variable as well in quality, depending on some places better mapped than others. But the sad thing, and I'm digressing slightly as usual, but Petty's survey was probably the greatest disaster to befall the Catholic Irish. Why? Because had the Cromwellian regime only lasted a short time before Cromwell died and the restoration happened. And what made it so, but by that stage, the land transfer had happened and proved to be largely irreversible. It happened because the survey was done in a timely fashion. Had the survey been slower, the land transfers would have been delayed. Would not have happened or even been complete by 1660, and you wouldn't have had the problem. The problem was that the land was granted before the restoration and didn't. So that survey, you can say intellectually at one level, it was a very accurate survey and a masterpiece of cartographic engineering, but its consequences for the losers.
Listen, before we finish, two things to say to you. First of all, what books have you written?
Lately I'm working on. I started my career writing about the Confederate Catholics. Then I moved gradually forward in time to looking at the Williamite period, that jumping from let's say Ireland to William, and now I've gone back again in time, and I'm looking at the Confederate Catholic War again. I'm working at that. So I've written mainly about that. I also wrote one book on Irish history in general in the 17th century called Consolidating Conquest, which was done for Rutledge. And I've written a detailed book on the Boyne called, excitingly enough, 1690 Battle of the Boyne. Wow, and that is an attempt to create, to describe something, try and put a shape on the chaos of battle or the chaos of events. And so I've written those, and I'm also, as you might have gathered, very interested in this question of disease and the impact. And this is, again, one of these seldom known facts, that until the American Civil War, 2/3 of the troops died of sickness. For every, it was every two for one. In the time we're looking at, it'll be 3 for 1 die of sickness rather than combat. So that it's an unexplored area of military history that I've probably bitten off more than I could chew. But I wrote a book 3 years ago on it called Fluxes, Fevers and Fighting Men. Fluxes, Fevers and Fighting Men. And it's a study of European warfare in the period 1680, the 30 Years' War, up to almost up to the French Revolution. So the 17th and 18th centuries, and I find it fascinating. But I do find most people, I have a course I'm teaching on to the students, and we'll see how that works out. Is it, it's a kind of like somebody was saying with the famine, it's a depressing sort of a topic at the same time. You know what I mean? It doesn't have a nice narrative arc. It's all, but it's not everybody's cup of tea. But I'm kind of absorbed with it at the moment, you know.
Yeah. And finally, what happened when this war was over? We had the Treaty of Limerick, right? What is your view on the whole treaty? Well, we know it was broken. It was only signed and broken nearly a week after. What is your opinion on the treaty? Should it have happened? I don't know, like what? Just in general, like what do you think of the treaty?
Well, when Ginkell thought he had failed, Ginkell has given up on, this is the second siege of Limerick we're looking at now. We're looking at, or rather our fourth siege, the 1691 siege. Ginkell has tried everything. He's tried attacking the Irish town. He had tried attacking across the Abbey River into the English town. He's crossed over Thomond Bridge, and he's attacked, or crossed over, not Thomond Bridge, crossed over Pardine and come round by Thomond Bridge, and he's attacked that. Still hasn't worked, right? And he's given up for, he wrote literally to Dublin saying, that's it, guys, game over. And then the Irish come out and say, we'd like to talk. That's the context in which they're discussing. Ginkell wants them, is prepared to give them a good deal because he knows that if he doesn't, this war will go on into the next year. And he, as far as he's concerned, and he's told William this, pleading with him to make more attractive terms, you want land confiscations, but the cost of another months of war is more than the cost of all of these, or the benefits of these. So he's able to give good terms, and he offers good terms. Now, the question of the broken treaty, the question of the articles, the question on religious freedom, for example, that they shall enjoy such privileges in the exercise of the religion as are consistent with the laws of Ireland, or as they did enjoy in the reign of Charles II. Okay, that is anybody, a first-year law student, would see that there's at least three big loopholes in that guarantee. Think about it. That the Irish shall enjoy such privileges, not rights, privileges, in the exercise of their religion as are consistent with the laws of Ireland. Okay, who makes the laws of Ireland? The Irish Parliament. Who is the dominant force in the Irish Parliament?
Protestants.
There are no Irish Protestants. Therefore, what you're saying is we will take, or we will have whatever privileges, not rights, as are consistent with the laws that are made by the Irish Parliament. That's not a guarantee. I mean, and what I can't figure out is why did they sign off on this? And I think the reason is that Sarsfield doesn't really care or worry that much about the stay-at-homes. He just wants to get this army out of here intact. So he's worried about ships, about provisions, about getting the army to France, and he actually doesn't think they're going to keep the word anyway in the longer run. So he might as well sign up to that as sign up to anything else. He doesn't actually, I think he couldn't have. I mean, why would anybody? And the other thing, you know, so that's is you can drive a coach and four to that religious guarantee. And that's the main, from that then the penal laws arise. Now you might say that the penal laws are against the spirit of the treaty. They're certainly not against the letter of it. The letter of it allows that to happen. And I can't understand why they signed off on that. They could have said, no, we're not signing off on it. Ginkell could have said, sorry, Tony, you want to come in there, Tony, or Tommy?
Oh no, I was just thinking there, when the British broke the Brexit treaty, people said that the only people that weren't surprised were Limerick people, you know.
Yeah. There is, but, there is a certain tendency in which they will, that the states, the French have a phrase, perfidious Albion, that you actually can't trust English statecraft, that they won't actually keep a deal when it's no longer in interest to do so. Now, having said that, or if you're going to do a contract or a deal or a treaty, you make sure you pin it down and you don't leave any wriggle room. And this thing had loads of
It's kind of depressing that, in a sense, when you think about it. It's depressing what happened, Anyway.
It's depressing that we like. I think had Richard Talbot, Earl of Tyrconnell, dies of apoplexy or whatever it was at the early stage of the siege. He's in Limerick, and that guy had been around the block. He has a head on his shoulders. He's a good negotiator. He has a good sense of what is achievable. He is committed to the Irish in Ireland. Lucan or Sarsfield he's a Ballinity and he's an inspirational figure, but he's not in the same league as Talbot as regards as a political thinker, as somebody who is able to see the implications of things, who can take the wider view. And I think the tragedy from the Irish point of view is that Talbot wasn't around to steer the process of capitulation. He would have done so with a much greater sense of what was achievable and what was not achievable than Sarsfield.
More practical,
You know, Padraig, that when you have them at, there's a group getting together. They're going to go over and dig up Sarsfield.
I heard that. Oh, by the way, I didn't get a plug in. I wrote a book. I wrote a biography of Talbot as well, called.
Talbot? He's the Earl of Tyrconnell, is it?
Yeah, Earl of Tyrconnell, and it's called.
Talbot, yeah. Well,
I forgot. But it's where is it? Where is it?
All your books anyway can be accessed.
It can be accessed, yeah.
The library.
But no, they're looking at Sars. They're not quite sure where Sarsfield. They know the graveyard he's in, but there's a couple of bodies there, and have they identified his one yet?
I don't know, Padraig. No, I'm very skeptical about digging up Sarsfield. Very skeptical now, I'd be.
They're not going to. Why are they going to disinter the body?
I get at you privately about that now, what the whole thing is about.
Okay, all right.
I wouldn't be very enamoured with that now. And did he say, when he was dying, did Sarsfield say, if this had only been for Ireland? My answer to that is, he said, will somebody get me a bandage? I'm bleeding to death. We thought he wanted to keep this for Ireland. I don't know.
Well, it's a good story, all right. He took, but now, in fairness, I suppose he took a few days to die.
Yeah.
So he was mortally wounded, and he was brought away to this monastery, or whatever, or convent, and that's where he passed away. So he would have had time for musings on what was happening. But I think it's probably apocryphal. Sarsfield's commitment, he was a brave soldier, but once, as far as he was concerned, the game was up in Ireland. He was establishing a career for himself and his fellow exiles in the army abroad. Now, he was expecting that they would invade England. And that's why after Limerick, they're all concentrated in the Normandy Peninsula. They're supposed to descend on England, and then bang, it doesn't happen because the French lose command of the seas. And at that stage, that's the end of the adventure. 1692, they're all scattered. Italy, even Sarsfield himself was not with an Irish unit. He is a cavalry commander in the French army. So he's not actually even, there are Irish troops at the Battle of Landen, but they're in an entirely different part of the battlefield, and the Irish Guards, and they take heavy casualties. And but Sarsfield doesn't play a direct role with the Irish after that. I mean, after the Cotentin, the scattering of the armies, he's just another senior officer in the French army.
Anyway, Tom, I think we'll leave it there.
Maybe it'll be 1 o'clock again before we finish.
Gentlemen, I enjoyed our chat. It was far less stressful than I feared. Thank you for that.
Stressful? And I don't like causing anybody any stress, you know.
I know. Can I put my map back up on the wall now?
Oh, you can. Padraig, can I thank you for coming on? And I really enjoyed it now. And
thank you, Padraig.
I could have had another 99 questions. We'd have to, when all goes well, we hope, and this whatever you want to call it, pandemic or whatever you want to call it, will have to come down. I did say to you at the launch of Kieran O'Murco's book in Ennis, I met you last, and I said it to you, it'll have to come down, and Katrina will have to get her down as well. You know, to give a talk.
Love to know it. And please God, this is one thing I'm getting from this is you will never stop me traveling again.
Well,
I'm going to be on the road. We've been locked down long enough. Gentlemen, thanks for
Thanks, Padraig. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And this is Tony Brown from the Limerick Historical Society with Tom Donovan saying thank you all and watch this. By the way, this will be up on YouTube. We hope in about 3 or 4 hours, and you can reach it again. Okay. Thank you all very much. Good luck, Joe.
Bye-bye.